Hello, everyone. As I stated today in class, I'm going to try to do a short tutorial on how to do the long-term capacity planning. I hope you find this useful. Just recall we'll have office hours. Justin will and I will. I'll be here on Wednesday. And then we'll be holding links mid-cycle reviews on Thursday, and I can answer any questions earlier in the day if you might have any about it. But without any further ado, let me share my screen and we will bring up the presentation and we'll walk through how we will go about solving or finding solutions to this gap that exists between what I would consider to be the demand with leeway and what we want to do in terms of trying to solve that. So you'll see I put together a small presentation. Hopefully we won't be death by PowerPoint, but here we go. It really is how to analyze this problem and how to solve it when, as I said, we have a demand that's larger than our ability to meet it. I'm going to a certain extent, start again in terms of walking through this material, just as if you hadn't been introduced to it. So for those of you that this is a review, hopefully it'll be a helpful one. If you recall, one of the things that I did earlier this morning in class is that I wanted to make sure that you understood where these numbers come from because you might need to calculate them. We're given a forecast here, and this one is with leeway, and I'll talk about that in a second. But if you recall, we talked about in lecture today that the forecast really comes from that long-range business plan. And this is what we consider to be our leadership team of marketing, sales, finance. Probably we're going to have the C-level involved in terms of the CEO, but we're going to determine for each of our SKU families or for a category, because remember we need to know at the SKU level or SKU family in terms of supply chain, what we forecast demand to be for the future. And in this case, it's going to be year 1, year 2, 3, 4, and 5. For many firms, looking out 5 years is not at all uncommon. Once we get this plan, then what happens is that we tend to add a bit of what I consider to be a buffer to it, or as I refer to it, a fudge factor. So the figures here in terms of demand simply represent, and you see where my arrow is, that forecast where we've already applied a 10% buffer, or in this case, a 10% leeway. So we simply took demand, multiplied it by the 1.1. So this is also reported in million cases. And so as you see here, otherwise we'd have lots of zeros. We're interested in doing this long-term capacity planning for North America, for Latin America, for Western Europe, for Eastern Europe, for the Middle East and Africa, and for Asia. So this is where the numbers, we'll come back to this table because it's a very important component of what we do in terms of analyzing and then solving the problem for long-term capacity. We're also given this information. We're looking at global production and we're looking at what happens whether or not you have a flexible or a dedicated line. Let's take a look at some of these. In North America, we have 2 lines. We talked in class today a little bit about how we do the numbering for these lines. We always tend to be what I consider to be North America centric, which we start with the number 1, and then if we added to this, it would be a line 3. You'll notice here that as we move through the different regions, it's not that this is an absolute, but I just have seen this used several times in terms of the geography closest to us, like Latin America gets to be the 10 and so forth. So if we added a line, for example, in Asia, it's probably going to be 51. If we added another line, it would be 52. Just like if we ended up adding another line in Western Europe, where we're located in Geneva, we'd probably add a line 22. So please pay attention to that. It's not a critical factor, but it is one of those things that will separate you from the others that hadn't noticed this numbering convention. You'll notice that we have dedicated and we have flexible lines. We also discussed this in class this morning. If we have a dedicated line, what we're saying is that we have enough volume for that particular SKU or SKU family to totally have it run nothing else but that product. If we have a flexible line like we do in Latin America, what we're saying is that the demand is probably not large enough for us to do one of those as a dedicated. It would not keep our assets busy enough. So what we're going to do is that we add a bit of conversion kit to it. We add some more things, and we turn that line 10 that's in Latin America into a flexible line. It can run either product. And so that's the difference here. For our example that we did today in class, we can do 200 cases per hour. And that seems to be what we consider to be our theoretical optimum in terms of that 200. We take that operating efficiency at 100%. And then we start looking at the 5 days, and we also look at what happens when it's not the 200 cases per hour, which is why we also multiply it by 75, 85, 90%, whatever it happens to be. We will come back to these two tables several times as we're trying to solve this gap between demand with leeway and then what happens in terms of the capacity that we need. When we think about the different options that we have, these are also things that we discussed this morning, but I'm going to touch on them once again because they're a part of our toolkit, our solution set that we have. So if we think about all the things that we can do, we have 6 items that are listed here. And so when you put together your table about where gaps exist and you start thinking about things that you might use to close that gap, these are the 6 that you're going to choose from. Let me start at the bottom. It seems like an odd thing to do, but I will do that. In many cases, if you do not have a differential of 100,000 cases, which is what we're setting our gap differential at for doing something about it, then we would simply write do nothing. And that in and of itself is an action because we're not taking any. If we think about what's going on, it's possible that we could build a new line. But look at the cost of that. One time, $50 million. And not only that, it's going to take 2 years after we fund it for it to be able to come online. So that's more of a long term and where we see a lot of sustained growth that can't be solved by using things like converting a dedicated line to a flexible one, or having an increase in operating efficiency or that operating ratio itself, or from moving from a 5-day to perhaps a 7-day operation. So when we think about building that new line, it definitely is something that we're going to do when we think a region is growing enough to be able to take on that level of investment. If we're thinking about countries or regions, and I'll use North America as an example, while we're growing, it's not at the same rate as we would see perhaps in Asia. For that reason, we're probably going to use more options like 2, 4, and perhaps 5. We need incremental growth in capacity to meet the demand as it's growing, also incrementally. And when we get down to the table where we're looking at possible solutions for the least amount of investment, then we'll talk about some of these again. If we convert a dedicated line to a flexible one, remember if it goes to flexible, we're going to lose 2 hours in terms of that changeover part that's needed as well. And if we also convert something to from a dedicated to a flexible, it's going to take us a year to be able to put that into place. I'll come back to the cross region in just a second. If we want to increase our operating efficiency, we're also going to have to make an investment for every 5 points. So if we're at 75% operating efficiency and we want to increase it up to 85%, that would be 10 points. And that's going to cost us $2 million a time. So that would be $4 million if we increase it from 75 to 85. But if we went from 75 to 80, which is just 5 points increase, it would only cost us a one-time cost of $2 million. It also takes us a year to be able to increase that operating efficiency. Think about that as a continuous improvement project. We'd have to study it, we'd have to make recommendations, and then we'd have to work on the implementation. So a year is what we would do after that investment. Something we can do immediately is that we can shift from 5 days operations to 7. Now remember, we're paying people. So every year we're operating 7-day operations because almost everything we start with in our base and assumption is that it's 5 days. We're going to have to pay $5 million in overtime. That's our budgeted amount for that. Let me come back to the cross-region supply now. I think I mentioned today in class, we really consider this a nuclear option. Think about that. If we ship things across region, we're going to have all kinds of tariffs, duties. We might be borrowing a product from one region to take care of the one that has the need and end up starving the one later that has that need. it's to be avoided at all costs. I refer to it as a nuclear option, and it certainly is. Okay, the first thing we did today in class is that you were asked in terms of the task to fill in this production chart to just get some experience and to feel comfortable calculating what that capacity utilization or that operating efficiency was for both a 5-day dedicated and flexible, as well as for a 7-day operation. We walked through the various calculations for one of each. In class, I did the 5-day dedicated. We ended up with 240 operating days. And then we also did a flexible 7-day operation where we had 340 days. I have posted the key to the in-class solution. And so as we know, it looks like, and this is in millions of cases, that our solution for the one we worked on in class was 860,000 cases. When we put it in the table, it ended up being 0.86. And likewise, when we solved for the 7-day operation for flexible for 75% operating efficiency, we ended up with 1.12 or 1,100,000, and it ended up being 22,000 cases. Don't worry so much about the rounding. Here it was 864,000, but the fact of the matter is that we're still operating off of a forecast that we know is in all likelihood going to be wrong, and we've already added a buffer. So unless it's 865,000, whatever it happens to be, then perhaps we'll round it up to the 0.87, but these examples, we don't have to worry with that point. Now you'll notice here already that to make sure that we don't have to keep looking at charts and what's going on, you'll notice that what we've done here is that we've put particular areas affiliated with their current operation. So let me see if I can show you how this chart is coded. So if we're looking at Latin America, we currently have 2 SKU families, but it's a flexible line. It's running at 60% operating efficiency, which means its current capacity is 0.63 or 630,000 cases. Let me point out another one. North America and Western Europe are running at 85% capacity currently, 5-day. We have dedicated lines there, and they are running at 0.98 capacity. This is just a handy thing. It's not a necessary step, and in fact, I didn't do this today in class just simply because I didn't want to complicate what you were trying to absorb, because there's a lot of different things here that are new to you. So if you want to code your production chart in this manner, certainly you can. It keeps you from needing to look back at an additional table, but it's also more time to do that. So whatever your particular pleasure is, to make sure you get these numbers correct. The next thing that we did in class is we said, let's get some experience then calculating that capacity, not calculating the capacity utilization, but looking at these reference tabled numbers from the previous 2 charts that we want to bring over to this table, because the step after this is determining where do we have gaps. Now you'll recall in class that what we did is that we simply looked up these table functions. We looked it up for North America, where we said the demand for leeway for the current year was 1. It's 1 in year 1, 1.1, 1.2. I'm going to go back up so you can take a look at that to make sure that that's the case. If I look at North America, it absolutely is for SKU family A. Year 1, it's 1. Year 2, it's 1.1. Year 3, 1.2, and so forth. So that's where that tabled number comes from. All right, let's see what the second one is. Now remember, we're not dividing anything here. So that's 1 million cases in the current year, 1 million cases in year 2, 1,100,000 cases of demand with leeway in year 2. So don't think that this is out of 100 or anything else. This is just simply millions of cases that are stated in that way, the 1.1. The second number here, we said, we're just separating it from the demand with leeway by looking at the second one, which is demonstrated capacity, 0.98, 0.98. Unless we do something to change that capacity, that's what we're showing currently and all the way through year 5. And this method will make more sense in just a moment. In other words, we have the capacity in year 2 to make 980,000 cases, but we have an estimated or forecasted demand with leeway of 1,100,000 cases. There might be a problem here. All right, so we're going to do the same for Western Europe. What we simply do, we'll look up those tabled functions for, or those tabled data for demand with leeway, and we're going to separate that from the demonstrated capacity by simply doing the slash between them. All right, I have the solution for that. As I said, that's been posted. So if we're looking at Western Europe, it looks like in the current year, the demand with leeway in the current year is 1 million, and we currently have demonstrated capacity of 980,000, which is represented here as 0.98. You'll notice that the only thing that changes in this table is really the demand with leeway, and that's because of the following. Now that we have this table completed, what we want to do is that we want to look at which areas for what year and for what particular SKU families do we have an issue in terms of not having enough demand. Where do we have a gap? In class, what we did is that we circled those. What I'm going to do in terms of this presentation is that I've highlighted those, and those should match they should match exactly with the ones that we circled in class. We are using for our differential 100,000 cases or 0.1. So we're looking at examples of here, the 1,100,000 cases that we need versus the 980,000 that we need, that we have currently in capacity. That's greater than 100,000 cases. And if you look at it previously here, if the differential is only 20,000 cases or 0.02, here that differential is a lot larger. So we've highlighted all of those where it's greater than the 0.1 or 100,000. This, I think, is a really necessary step, so you determine what areas do we have problems for that we need to come up with an action plan to be able to take care of that gap. But I know I've said this a number of times, but when I come back and I look at this next page and I'm starting to set up what my long-term capacity decision plans are, I know that I'm finished when I can look at these particular years, and for everywhere where I have that gap that's larger than the tolerance that I'm willing to live with, then I know that I put something into place to take care of that. So far, so good. This is where we got to class today, where I think everybody was feeling, very comfortable in terms of the material and what to do with it. So let's proceed from here. But before we do that, let me talk about the fact that if you look at what's happening here in terms of North America, remember what I said? We have demand that's growing incrementally, and capacity is going to stay the same unless we change it. And that becomes a problem, not in year 1, but in year 2, 3, 4, and 5, it does get to be a problem, but it's not huge. It's not a huge gap in terms of capacity. Let's drop down here and let's look at Asia, for example. In the current year, we have demand with leeway of 600,000 or 0.6. We have capacity, demonstrated capacity, of 0.79 or 790,000. So we have more capacity in the current year than we actually have demand to use. In the year 1, it's almost even if you look at that. Now what happens in year 2 is that we hit really very significant and dramatic growth. We go from 0.8 or 800,000 to 1.6 million cases in demand with leeway. But unless we change demand, we're going to be woefully outpaced, and we're going to have a lot of unmet demand. So this tells us in year 2, 3, 4, and 5, we've got to do something drastic. We cannot just simply move from 5 to 7 days or improve operating efficiency. And we're really, both of these are dedicated lines, or excuse me, it's a flexible line right now. But if we think about what we need to do with that amount of growth that's happening, it's obvious that we're going to have to put in new capacity in terms of lines very quickly. So look at this and get a sense for what you might need to do before you go to the next page, because otherwise I think you're just going to be left trying to figure out, okay, what are my options here, and not really understand what's behind doing the planning for the long-term capacity. All right. So we know which areas are problems. North America, year 2 through 5. It appears that Latin America, in terms of years 3 through 5, is going to be an issue. If we look at Eastern Europe, it's going to have problems year 3 through 5. Now notice that Western Europe doesn't have any gap at all. So our action there is to simply do nothing. If I look at the Middle East and I look at Africa, we are anticipating demand with leeway in year 4 and 5 that's going to outstrip our demonstrated capacity. As we said, in China, from year 2 through year 5, definitely exponential growth. I'm going to take these kind of one at a time as we walk through them. If you think about North America and that our options are open to us, remember I said please look at what you see in terms of that gap and how large it is and how you might answer that solution. This one, unfortunately, I still have my misspelled words on it and some other things, but the key that's posted, I've corrected all of that. So in North America, in year 1, because it's going to take us a year to put any operating efficiency improvements into place, we're going to do that then because remember, if you recall, and I'll move back up to that slide, year 2 is when we need some additional capacity. So if that's the case, it's really not too large in terms of that need. So we like to do operating efficiency projects, I like to say, in North America. We're kind of trained that way. So we're going to move from 85 to 90% operating efficiency because we're only moving 5 points. That's going to be a $2 million investment. What that's going to get us in terms of North America, if we were doing that in the expanded chart, is that that's going to be able to take care of that gap that we're looking at. We're only going to do one of these, which is Asia. So I'll get into detail about how to fill out the bottom chart with that one. Now, when we get to year 3, however, remember, we're moving incrementally. So that took care of year 2, that took care of year 3 in terms of an operating efficiency. But by the time we get to year 3, took care of year 2, but by the time we get to year 3, we have some difficulty in terms of what are we going to do to take care of that gap. And so we've decided that what we're going to do is we're going to move from a 5-day operations to 7-day. Now, you might also try, because one of the things that I mentioned in class today is that the solutions can be slightly different. You might also decide that in year 2, you want to do another operating efficiency improvement where you want to go from 90 to 95%. I've seen some areas where we try to do that 10% jump all at once. I just will tell you from experience, while we could do that in terms of our exercise on an exam, it's very difficult to get a 10% operating efficiency improvement unless we just have some, I would say, kind of breakthrough technology or something happens in terms of the design of that process itself, and it's more, it seems to be easier to implement those 5% type of increments. So we've decided, just to show you, for example, what to do here, is that we're going to move that line, which is for the SKU family A. We're going to move it to a 7-day because we still have plenty of capacity for the line B, which is the LO2, the line O2. So it's only this particular line that needs some more capacity, which is probably why we're going to move those folks or those associates to 7-day. And that's going to cost us $5 million for every particular year that we do that. And so we'll see that incremental cost that's accounted for there. All right, Western Europe, we said do nothing because we still have more capacity than we have actual demand with leeway. Now, I could walk through all of these, but I'm going to leave that for you to do yourself. And instead, I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about Asia and our plans there. If you recall, and I'm going to go back up to the graph where we're looking at Asia, we've got significant problems beginning in year 2 in terms of how that growth is occurring. Currently, line 50 is flexible, and it looks like that combined demand, when we get to this year, I would think that as much as it's growing, it doubled. It's obvious that we need a dedicated line perhaps for each because they seem to be growing at least in year 2 and year 3 at the same pace. It takes 2 years to put that into place. So in the current year, I'm going to ask for funding. I'm going to assume that I'm going to get it, and I'm going to build a dedicated line 51. And you'll note here that we said in year 2, that's going to come on line. That's going to cost us $50 million. Okay? In year 2, what I'm going to look at in terms of doing, I'm going to build that flexible line 52 to be able to take care of that increased demand as well. That's going to come online in terms of year 4, although I really think that flexible line is not a 2-year investment, but rather a 1 year in terms of that component. Let me check that because I think that year 4 is not correct for that one. I think it is year 3. And then in year 5, we're going to move 2 of those lines to 7-day. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself because whichever one you do here in terms of you're asked to expand and ask you to confirm that the plan for the region will work, even on a, as it relates to a homework, as it relates to exam, we're not going to ask you to do all of them. We will ask you maybe to do a couple, maybe one that's not so complex like North America or Latin America, but almost always you'll be asked to do one where we've got this exponential growth that's a little bit trickier. So let's look at what happens here in this table, and I'll go back and forth between these 2 charts. I'm going to post this presentation as well under today's lecture, so you'll have it and can print it out if you want to look at it yourself. So we said the current year, we simply are looking at the demand with leeway, and then we're looking at the available demonstrated capacity. Our demand with leeway in the current year is 600,000 for both A and B. It's a flexible line, and we have the demonstrated capacity to produce 790,000 cases. Not a problem. We said in year 1, we really don't have a problem either. We have the demand that's getting greater, but we also have the available capacity, demonstrated capacity to take care of it. It's in year 2 where we run into problems. Now, this is where we said, if we look at what's going on here, we said we're going to add this flexible line, we're going to add this dedicated line B. If that's the case, 50 can be dedicated to A. And if that's the case, go back to your original data, and what you will see is that in year 2, each of those particular SKU families, A and B, have 800,000 cases demand with leeway, and that's what that 0.8 represents. We have the new line that came on board, and if you look at the current operating efficiency, and it's a dedicated line, we are able to go back and to determine that looking at Asia, I'm going to check my chart again, that if I look at what's going on in terms of Asia, and they're currently at that 75% operating efficiency. Remember, we calculated that, and we calculated it at 864,000 cases, or 8.86, and that absolutely is the case. That takes care of year 2, and I know it now. Let me go back up to this other page. In year 2, we said what we're going to do is that we're going to build that dedicated line in the current year. It'll be operational in year 2, and sure enough, that took care of our needs. So year 2 is taken care of. Look what happens, however, in year 3. We have 1 million cases demand for both SKU family A and SKU family B. If I go back up to this page, and that's when I knew that this one wasn't correct, it's going to come into place in year 3. And I know that because when I build that flexible line, it's going to be able to do either that line 52. Look what comes into play when I do that in year 2 in terms of the amount of capacity that comes online. Well, it looks like in terms of that flexible line, in terms of the 2 years as we've set it up here, what's going to happen for 52, we're going to ask for that in year 2. It's going to become operational in year 4, simply because we don't need that capacity here. And so if we look at that, we really don't have a gap in year 3. We plan that for year 2. Then it looks like in year 4, what we're able to do with that flexible line is it's going to catch the differential between that demand with leeway and then what we're going to have in terms of our capacity to handle that. If I add 0.9, 0.9, and 0.7, I'm going to end up, and I'm going to have to do some real quick math here in terms of looking at that. So instead of it's 1.8 and 7, I've got 2.5 in terms of that estimated or that demand with leeway. And it looks like I have more than enough and a little bit of capacity left over to be able to take care of that in year 4. What happens in terms of year 5 then is, what happens in year 5 is that I'm going to have another gap in terms of the capacity. So it's a small one, however. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to move 2 of those lines to 7 days. And because I have 2 particular lines that are going in overtime, it's going to be 5 million for each of them. And you'll notice in terms of the operating efficiency, I'm also going to increase that in year 2 up by the 10 points. So excuse me for getting confused on that one earlier. So let me see if I can walk through this one a little bit easier. All right. And on the key, I've also rearranged this. We have the operating efficiency that goes up 10 points, and that's the one that's implemented within the year. So if we're looking from going from 0.86 to 0.98, what we have in front of us here is exactly what happened to increase that capacity from that year 2 to year 3. My apologies for that particular mistake, and hopefully I haven't confused anybody. Let me say that again. We were able to increase the demonstrated capacity in year 2 to year 3 by increasing that operating efficiency. Now you see why I always want to make sure my years are aligned. Bring a pencil because you're probably going to need to leave some lines between some of those when you do this, and make sure that you can group your lines, because one particular option may not solve it all. It may take a combination of two being phased in at different times to solve things. So improving that operating efficiency by 10 percentage points is going to enable us to go from 0.86 to 0.98. Then what happens in terms of that flexible line is that it's going to come into play in year 4. And what happens with that particular one, we'll see it's here at line 52. It's going to catch the slack from what we need from A and B to be able to cover our total demand with leeway. So we're adding that flexible line. It has, as we split up that demand, we're still going to look at 0.9 and 0.9, and we're going to have that one take care of 700,000 of those cases. That's where I said that this math can get a little bit messy. You could still leave that at 1.0 if you would like to, but you'll notice that in terms of looking at that year 4, at that point in time, we have 2.5 million cases that we need to make. And so when I add these numbers up, that's exactly the number I need to get in terms of the demand that's being met. And then hopefully if we look at our demonstrated capacity, we also have that. And you know from looking at this that we have more than enough by adding that flexible line. We didn't have enough demand for either A or B to build another dedicated line, but we certainly needed to be able to add enough capacity that's going to act as the buffer for both of those SKU families. Let me go back up to the other page. So we're looking at year 5 because we still need some additional demonstrated capacity. This is where I want to say to you once again, part of what's happening here in year 5, that demand could either be higher, it could flatten a little bit. We review these things every year, but we're trying to do the plan in this current year for 5 years out. And we know when we get here that this amount of capacity is not going to be able to take care of what our forecasted demand with leeway is going to be in year 5. So what we simply said that we're going to do to be able to take care of that is that we're going to move those 2 lines. We're going to move 50 and we're going to move 51 to 7 days. And that's probably a pretty good long-term plan, because what that does is it bumps up our demonstrated capacity from 980,000 cases, or 0.98, to 1.39 million for both of those lines. And then as we get closer to year 5, when we're in year 1 and it's the current year, that number in terms of the estimate is either going to hold true or it's going to grow some more. And then we have the capability of changing that because we still have enough time out from that to be able to do that. I hope that you've found that this particular short lecture on how to do this will be worthwhile. You really have to sit down and you have to think about it in terms of a puzzle. I'm going to go back up in the presentation now to a particular page to talk about all the things we can do. This is your solution set that you can draw from. All of these options, but you have to think about what solution is going to be best. Do not, as I said in the second section today, use the sledgehammer when a hammer would do to hang the picture hanger on the wall. And I want you to think about that. So when we talked about Asia and we needed just a bit more capacity, we needed it on both of those for the SKU family A and SKU family B. We're not going to build another dedicated line for those 2 products to take care of what really is what I would consider to be that extra demand that we need to be able to cover. But as I said, it's not sufficient in terms of doing dedicated. A flexible line is a great example of what to do for that. So think about how much the gap is. Think about all the possible options that you might have to solve that. Almost always for Asia, we're going to need to add a line. If I look at North America, almost always it seems to be incremental, smaller, but incremental changes that we're going to look at in terms of efficiency. Think about the solution and what it might look like in terms of what you might need to do for each of those. And as I said, take a look at the solution set. It is correct, even though I bumbled through a part of that, a lot of numbers and a lot of moving parts. And I'll make sure that the timing and how long it takes to implement something is correct on the key, as well as the instructions for how long it takes it to put it into place. I hope you find this useful. If not, Justin will be holding office hours and I can certainly answer questions. The homework is due a week from today. It is due on March the 29th, which is Thursday. Please bring it with you to your links mid-cycle review and you can turn it in that way, hard copy. As I said, I hope you like solving these large problems like this. There's a lot of value to people and companies that understand how we can wisely invest the limited money that we have in our organizations.